The Nigeria Center for Disease Control sent an advisory yesterday about Ebola. And it's a word that comes, when I think Ebola, I think salt. I don't, because I remember how bad it was at the time. Everybody was bathing in salt and water. And of course, we've been commended in many ways for the way we handle these sorts of infections. But we saw this advisory and it got us thinking about what's in place, what should we be worried about, because they told us things that we should be doing right now. And because of this, we have someone to discuss this outbreak that we're hearing has happened in other parts of Africa, but he's going to be breaking it down for us. We have with us a professor of infectious disease and public health epidemiology, director of Global Health and Infectious Disease Control Institute in Nasarawa State University, KEFI, Mr. Akiala Ishaku. Thank you so much for being with us on the program.
Thank you, Kela. Happy New Year and good morning, Nigerians.
Okay, good morning.
Good morning.
Okay, so when we heard Ebola, like I said, my heart skipped another beat. Yeah. What again? We cannot have Ebola. God will not do that to us. Yeah. But talk to us a little bit about the situation on ground.
Okay, so on the 30th of January, the Minister of Health in Uganda confirmed an Ebola case from a post-mortem analysis. So
someone had died.
Someone had died.
And then they checked the cause of death.
Absolutely.
And it was Ebola in Uganda.
In Uganda.
Okay.
And the good news is that there has been 44 contacts. So this in epidemiology, there is what we call contact tracing.
Yes.
If Akiala is positive to an infectious disease of high global security threat, you contact people around me that I may have had an encounter with. So 44 people were, contact traced. And the good news is that none of them was positive for Ebola.
Okay.
And the person that died and post-mortem analysis was done on him, he was a health worker, a nurse. So that also raised a high suspicion about the people he has had contact with in terms of understanding the patients that he has had contact with and also colleagues that he has had contact with. But the good news is that that is the only case in Uganda, although WHO has raised that the outbreak is of high public health emergency, important, like an outbreak of international concern, because, with globalization, with international travels, someone can be in Uganda last night and this morning he can be in Nigeria or any part of the world. But the good news is that the Nigeria Center for Disease Control also sent an advisory, what you have before you, trying to tell us what we needed to do, trying to tell us the preparedness as a nation, what we had, how we needed to enhance or heighten security at our point of entry, be it land border, sea border, and also air border, and also look at around how we need to also observe the non-pharmaceutical measures of keeping our environment very clean, try to wash our hands, and be able to maintain the non-pharmaceutical measures that we did during COVID. And I think that is a very good advisory role.
I want to be able to get that statement exactly from the NCDC, so people can understand what it is that we're supposed to do. Travel advice.
Absolutely.
As well.
We should not travel to endemic areas.
Such as
Uganda itself.
Okay.
Countries that borders Uganda, we need to be also careful about.
What about travel from Uganda to Nigeria?
Absolutely. So that's why I said about active surveillance in our border. So we need to heighten surveillance in our own point of entry, be it land, be it sea, and also be it air. I think
the people who were contact traced, because I remember contact tracing, the people who were contact traced, are they also, because at least what I remember about how Ebola, well, it's not immediate, is it? When we had our case in Nigeria, the person, it took some days, Patrick Sawyer, it took some days before we started seeing the full-blown Ebola. So the people who have been, the 44 people who have been contact traced, are they also being watched?
Absolutely, they have been quarantined.
Oh, they've been quarantined?
Absolutely, not in Nigeria, but in Uganda.
Of course.
And the incubation period of this disease, we all know, is a public knowledge. It's about 2 to 12 days.
Yes.
So it has, but it has a very high fatality rate. of about 25 to 90%. So not only taking salt, you remember people waking up 1 a.m., 2 a.m. to bath with salt and all what have you. So there are a lot of misinformation myths around Ebola. But these 44 people have been quarantined, so they have been monitored over time. And the good news is that there has been positive results. If I say positive results, is that samples were taken and the result turns out to be negative. So it also gives us hope that it's not going to be, it's something that is an outbreak that can be contained. Just like the way it happened in 2022, it took 69 days for the outbreak to be contained within Uganda. But the good news is that there are also vaccines for this.
I was just going to go to that. Because for something so endemic,
absolutely,
you would think that the treatment should be...
Absolutely.
We should have that treatment now.
Absolutely. But the concentration is more on the endemic countries. You know, people needed to be immune to that because of the case fatality rate, the severity of the disease. And so countries around, clinical trials has been done, and then the rollout of the vaccines were done in countries in Zaire, in Congo, and Uganda, countries around.
So there's a vaccine?
Absolutely.
Is it in Nigeria?
Not yet, but there are vaccines that have been rolled out in Uganda. And so you asked a very valid question. So these are the kind of conversations that we need to have on a national discourse. You remember during COVID, we spoke about vaccines development in country. What happened, Kela? What really happened? You ask when you're talking about security in a boy instead, where did we drop our guns? So this calls for a national discourse. And I'm of the opinion that we don't actually need to throw away the presidential task force that we had during COVID. Would have had, you know...
Well, a lot of them are not in government anymore.
Of course, but would have had them in place and have a post-COVID plan.
Okay.
You know, we are being defaced with a lot of infectious diseases such as monkeypox, such as even the COVID itself, and other Lassa fever. You remember in Plateau State, we had 2 cases of death now, and other states like Ebonyi and, you know, part of Benue would have had a presidential task force team to look at emerging and re-emerging diseases. They can be tenure-based, bring experts to be able to sit on a round table and to look at how they can chant a national plan to contain or to prepare for future pandemics.
You know, we're talking, I think last week we were talking about institutes in Nigeria,
Absolutely.
Research institutes,
Absolutely.
and the work that they have to do. I'd never forget during COVID,
Absolutely.
one of the first things we realized that there were a lot of people who read biochemistry in Nigeria who were not doing biochemistry work. It was the need for biochemists that dragged all of them back
Absolutely.
into that industry. So let's talk a little bit about institutes. You are a professor of infectious disease and public health epidemiology. And of course, you look at infectious diseases. What sort of research? You're at the Natural State University
Absolutely.
in Kefi.
Absolutely.
Do you have a research arm there? And how much work is going on? And then this funding issue that we hear about, is that a problem?
Yeah, it is a major problem. Let me also state it clearly that post-COVID, even post-Ebola, there is no institute in Nigeria or a research institute that works on Ebola.
We don't have one?
We don't have anyone working on Ebola. We're talking about COVID now. How many of our universities, how many of our institutes are working on Ebola and COVID? Post-COVID. How many are looking at, except one, the Redeemer University in Ede, which is being headed by Professor Happy. But how many people are working on the computational biology and the bioinformatics assays, platform research on COVID? Even on Ebola, because those are kind of research that they are translational. They lead to the production and designs of vaccines. So in Nasarawa State, we're a baby institute. We started 2 years ago, and what we did was to galvanize this idea because we saw there was a gap. Once we have a pandemic of global outlook or anything that is endemic, we tend to forget about it once we throw away our guns. Let me use your language. So what we did was that we brought young research group of mid-time career researchers to come to look at different working groups. So we have working groups working on cholera. And I'm glad to tell you that I was hired by International Red Cross to design the National Cholera Program for the country, and tomorrow it will be launched. at Sheraton, Abuja Continental Hotel. There are other groups that are working on viral hepatitis.
But no one is working on Ebola.
No one is working on Ebola.
No one is working on COVID.
No one is working on COVID. Is that okay? So
I want to go back to this Ebola story because there's someone just sent me a message and I was like, I should have asked that question earlier. While we're looking at raising security at our airports, what about our land borders?
Absolutely, they are quite porous. And we can actually use technology to be able to man our land borders.
Does the NCDC have any role to play in this?
So it has to be a multi-agency collaboration.
Led by who, though? When it came to COVID, the NCDC seemed to be at the forefront.
Absolutely.
Even with Ebola at the time, was the NCDC.
Absolutely. So the Federal Ministry of Health, the NCDC, and other partners. But when you are talking about border, who mans the border?
Immigration.
The immigration, the custom. So we intend to see that they have a specialized mobile labs within a component where they can reduce the turnaround time for testing of most of these infectious diseases. We can also send drones in the air to man our borders. With the issue of artificial intelligence now, we can be able to do a lot of diagnostic testing using AIs. There are a lot of biotechnological AIs that are diagnostic embedded.
I want to be able to get my colleague in Lagos to ask you a few questions. Go ahead, Ayo.
You know, Kayla, Prof, the issues that you have raised there are so many that it begs the question of whether or not we could have gotten ahead of, we can actually get ahead of some of these things. Going by the question Kayla asked the other time about our capacity and the fact that some of the capacities we have, we kind of suspended them. So I want to focus on risk factors. You talked about the risk factors earlier, and there are quite a number of them. The question that I want to ask about risk factors is if we had the capacity to checkmate them should they show up. For instance, part of our risk factors, you just talked about border controls. That's a major risk factor, and the cross-border movements that we find difficult to stop. Then there is the healthcare system capacity, cultural practices. I heard somewhere that burial practices involving physical contact with the deceased are deeply rooted in some communities, which increase the risk of transmission and several other things like that. Do you think we have the capacity to mitigate the risk factors before they become endemic among us?
Ayo, that was a very valid question. And I want to look at the question you asked as looking at a coin from a legal tender from the both sides. Do we have the capacity? Yes. Do we also have the capacity? No. So on the yes part is that we have the capacity to diagnose these diseases, be it Ebola, be it any hemorrhagic fever. We can activate our LASA platforms to actually test for this disease called Ebola because it is on the category 3 highly pathogenic organism. Now, you made mention of whether we have capacity at our border. I can tell you no. Ayo, Kela, I traveled to Uganda of recent, and at the airport in Kigali, they asked me to use my smartphone to snap a barcode. And immediately, when I snapped, they asked me to impute my passport number and all my details by default, fill the form, and as I was walking, a thermometer that was hanged picked my temperature. And as I moved into the hall, they asked me whether I still want to do Mpox test or COVID test. I said yes. They took my samples. Till today, they are still testing for COVID at borders, at entry points in Kigali. When we traveled back home, we didn't see anything like that. When we traveled back home, I was expecting to see port health medical personnel to actually do some sort of checks, either using a thermometer to pick our temperature or even a form for us to fill. There was none. So, Ayo, the reason why I said no is that till now, our border seems to be porous because we have not yet heightened our surveillance searchlight on our point of entry. And I think that this brings to the national conversation on how we need to brace up for the challenges ahead. Beyond Ebola, there are a lot of infectious diseases that are drivers. The drivers is international or globalization or international travels. So it is quite key that we look into that at our border, at our point of entry. You also ask, okay, go ahead.
I mean, I don't know. Anyway, you talked about urbanization now. I mean, airports and all of those things, and people moving around is a risk factor, which everyone, would probably agree with you on. However, there are some communities. I mean, we talked about certain community practices earlier. So I'm just wondering what level of awareness they have to recognize, God forbid, these kinds of serious issues. You talked about ease of moving from, place to place in a country, particularly crossing our borders and all. And the first point of entry is a local community. Should anything like that happen, and then something like that happens in a particular community, what happens? Do we have any protocol, particularly at the PHC level, to mitigate some of these things just in case? Because we never know, do we?
We have protocol at our local levels, but they are not in practice. Most primary healthcare centers you go, there are protocols. There are work aids to be able to identify this. So I think it calls for a national, advocacy. I want to say that there is need for us to come round table for a multi-sectorial engagement. Not everybody has like to watch Channels TV and the conversation that we are bringing forth this morning. I'm of the opinion that the National Orientation Agency and other organizations starting with the responsibility of passing clear public health messages must be on ground to discuss this. And I want to also share with you that I want to commend the government of Bola Tinubu for coming up with the National Health Fellows. I've been on your channel severally to advocate for local health corps marshal. There is need for us, just like the way we talk about community policing, there is need for us to have local people at the grassroots that should be able to pick up any disease outbreak at our locality. They should be able to dictate, they should be able to respond to outbreaks of health emergencies. And as we begin to go do that, it happens in South Africa. They have local health corps marshals. In Rwanda, they have local. In Kenya, some counties, they have local health corps marshals. So I think time has come for us to, the way we are looking at state police, community policing, that stops us from also looking at local health corps marshals. Guys that will mount our borders at local community levels that should be able to report cases that are quite of national security in terms of health and also global health security. So I think there is need for advocacy. There is no end to advocacy. So I will encourage the National Orientation Agency can be able to move into that. For quite some time, even during COVID, they have been so silent over the issues of advocacy and also issues of training and retraining. Because of emerging and re-emerging diseases, a lot of protocols may have changed over time. So we had protocols to dictate most of these viral hemorrhagic fevers at local levels for Lassa fever, for Ebola, and all other hemorrhagic fevers. Okay. But how often are these people trained and retrained? So we need more training, and a lot of our healthcare personnel at local level need constant training and retraining.
Prof, one of the favorite questions I like to ask is around communication. Not just what is said, but how it is said. The advisory is out from the federal government, a federal government agency, NCDC. How do you propose that this be cascaded through the 36 states and the 774 local government areas in the country, so the news, the information gets down to the brass tacks, to the local levels as quickly and as elementarily as possible, so it's not misconstrued at all?
We can learn from the experiences of fighting HIV and AIDS. Or in my own opinion, I felt like we can decentralize NCDC. Every state needs to have its own state center for disease control. Just like the way we have SACA and we have LACA. We have SACA at the state level and we have LACA at the local government level. Because the flow of information has to go down to the local level. 2, we need to cascade this to sub-national level, down to the local level. And we need partners, local partners and international partners to be able to drive this process. But there must be a framework for decentralization of most of this advocacy. And it is quite key. We have the structure on ground, but it has not been efficient and it has not been functional. We need to activate that and be able to sustain it.
Okay, just to be clear, Prof, is this Ebola, this new outbreak, is it a totally different strain? We understand that during COVID, there were different strains that had that kind of mutated. You know, consequently, certain health protocols or medical protocols didn't quite work on subsequent strains. Is this Ebola virus a new strain, or it's just the same?
It's the same strain. There are 5 strains of Ebola that are quite endemic in Uganda, and 2 of them were responsible for the outbreak that we had in 2014 within the sub-Saharan Africa, that's the West African coast. We have the Zaire, we have the Tail Forest, and we have the Sudan strain. What is actually causing the outbreak in Uganda at the moment? It is the Sudan strain. So nothing has changed in terms of the strength. Nothing has changed like in terms of mutation, just like the way we had during COVID when we had Omicron and Delta. No, it is the Sudan strain. Now, Ayo, this strain was picked from a cadaver. This strain was picked from a dead body. You asked a question about of burials, right? We don't have an official protocol in country for burial of any kind. As a country, I can tell you that. Maybe we had it during COVID, and then you see some people on PPE bury other people and, you know, return back. But we don't have a national protocol that stipulates that if somebody dies, in fact, we don't also do surveillance. We don't also do what is called mortality surveillance. Someone died, what killed the person, what was responsible to mitigate outbreaks. So we don't have a national protocol for general burial. We only have protocol for burial if the person is suspected to die or confirmed to die of highly pathogenic diseases such as Lassa fever and Ebola and COVID. But we don't have a general protocol. And that hinges to a lot of limitations that has to do with culture and religion that you made mention from the beginning.
Which is an issue on its own, hence the question around states having their own SACA, SCDC, as you have proposed. But just this one last one from me for now, Prof. There are already, the NCDC is dealing with quite a number of disease outbreaks. Lassa fever, meningitis, diphtheria, and the rest of them. How will the NCDC prioritize resources to address the Ebola preparedness, seeing how virulent Ebola is over others?
Absolutely. So they have to look at the what we call the pathogenicity of the etiological agent, which Ebola is highly pathogenic, just like the way you mentioned. NCDC cannot do this alone. We need the private sector engagement, just like the way it happened during COVID. How many private labs were established during COVID and we abandoned them? Because we never had a post-COVID plan. I was expecting that these private labs would have been strengthened. I was expecting that we would have designated most of these private labs and upgrade them to the capacity to be able to diagnose highly pathogenic organisms. But we never did, we never did that. So if I asked you as a journalist, where is our post-COVID plan? Where do we intend to make use of the available resources that we have from the private sector to see how we can strengthen our healthcare system? The question is no. None. Ayo, Kela, we never even had a conference, post-COVID conference, to discuss what was the impact on the economy, what was the impact on our livelihood, how much we have lost, and where do we need to release resources for research.
I mean, the NCDC DG, right? I know we have a new Director General for the NCDC. I mean, I think the call is we need to build on the progress that has been made. But when COVID happened, we were applauded all over the world for the way that that strategic team handled it. Many Nigerians were not happy, but the right things that needed to be done were done at the time, and we saw the results that we got. And the applause, our model is being copied around the world.
Because there was private sector engagement.
Exactly. Well, the new DG of the NCDC, in many ways, really has to start thinking about building on those progress, on that progress that was made, and not us hearing, because a lot of things that you're saying right now are pretty disappointing, because you would think that after what happened, the post-COVID, post-Ebola, post-disease plans should be able to get us ready to handle these sorts of things. And I'm sure when we have a conversation with her at some point, she'll be able to tell us what it is that they've built on. But I want you to be able to look at that advisory before we go. So, Ayo was talking about cascading the information all the way down. So I'm just going to read them as much as I can here. So as many people who can hear us will be able to replicate it and tell their family members as well. Now, of course, the practicing of good hygiene, wash your hands regularly with soap under running water, or use hand sanitizers when soap and water are not readily available. That's one of the things that the NCDC is saying. Avoid physical contact with anyone who has symptoms of an infection with an unknown diagnosis. So you have to avoid
Kela, we are still battling with issues of water. How available are running water?
Avoid the consumption of bush meats. This is a big one. Avoid the consumption of bush meats, particularly bats, and non-human primates, which are known reservoirs of the Ebola virus. All right, so they live there. If you have to, ensure that such is properly prepared and cooked before consumption. Avoid direct contact with the blood, saliva, vomit, urine, and other bodily fluids of suspected or confirmed EVD cases. And if you or someone you know with a travel history to any country with Ebola cases experiences symptoms of EVD enumerated above, call 6232.
There's a
that's their
toll line.
That's their toll line.
Absolutely.
6232, or your state Ministry of Health hotline immediately for guidelines on how to go forward. And of course, that travel advisory 6232. That's the most important number right now. Going forward, as we wrap up on this conversation, as the Nigerian people, we're hearing this, we're nodding, okay. What next?
I think what next is that we need to actually see how we can strengthen our healthcare system by ensuring that, Kela, this is the first time you're getting a toll-free line. How many states have toll-free lines? Their Ministry of Health. So these are the kind of conversations. So we need to strengthen. And we need, what is quite key now is these are issues of, by strengthening our healthcare system, we need to also see to how we can fund our healthcare system. So health financing is quite key. Nigeria is donor dependent. Some of my postgraduate students did their research on how we can use a telecom surcharge to fund health insurance and design an economic model. Kela, they came up with a model that we can generate over 500 billion from telecom surcharge to fund healthcare.
When you talk about us being donor dependent, it's a very important line, because even in the advisory that they gave to the Nigerian people, they said there are vaccines and therapeutics available for some strains of the Ebola virus. The approved vaccine for the Zaire species, EBV, is not currently available in the country, but can be obtained from the World Health Organization, AFRO, and does not protect against the Sudan virus. So even that one doesn't work for this strain.
Absolutely. So the conversation is that we need to also deploy more resources on research. I'm hoping that we can have a presidential task force initiative. I'm looking that we may have a Bola Tinubu initiative to be able to raise vaccinologists, not of our generation, but a generation coming. For how long can the giant of Africa be the giant of Africa and we're not producing vaccines that we lost in 1991?
It's a very important point.
There are so many questions that
because the moment Donald Trump said they were not giving us vaccines for HIV, all of us started crying. All of us went into
South Africa produces its own.
But thankfully for now, that has been sorted out. But we do have to wrap it up there because we have to go. But I want to thank you very much.
Thank you, Stella, for having me.
For being with us. Joining us there, Professor Akiala Ishaku, who is the Professor of Infectious Disease and Public Health Epidemiology. Thank you again.
Thank you for having me.